I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement, and I am here with my guest, Bill Plotkin.
After 4 days alone in the wild, one's consciousness does change, and I would say it becomes much clearer, and we begin to see wild things more accurately, actually. It's out by an alpine lake. I got entranced by a spruce tree that was on the shore of that lake, and I was sitting those days, fasting, surrounded by absolute alpine magnificence, offering my reverent attention to the wild world around me. And this particular spruce really spoke to me in some way. I felt it was, or I knew it was, a monk. And my sense was that he was gazing very, very deeply into the world, more deeply than I knew it was possible. After a while, the spruce made a gesture, and I followed that gesture and saw a butterfly. And it actually came as close to brush against my left cheek. And as it did, I felt a communication. And what it said to me was, in essence, that my life would have a lot to do with learning how to weave cocoons, which are spaces of transformation, in particular places of death and rebirth.
Bill Plotkin, Ph.D., has been a psychotherapist, research psychologist, rock musician, river runner, professor of psychology, and mountain bike racer. As a research psychologist, he studied dreams and non-ordinary states of consciousness achieved through meditation, biofeedback, and hypnosis. He has guided thousands of people through initiatory passages in nature since 1980. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks. Good to be here.
And you are initially a psychologist, and you have written 2 books. One of them is called Soulcraft, and the other one is called Nature and the Human Soul. But what I'd like to ask you first is that you're a psychologist out of the University of Colorado, and that you went to practice psychology in New York in your late 20s.
Actually, I was a research psychologist after finishing grad school, and I went to New York to take my first university position. And I was studying and researching non-ordinary states of consciousness, in particular meditation, dreams, hypnosis.
Yeah. And then in your book Soulcraft, you talk about how you were hiking, and I don't remember exactly where it was, but you were in Colorado and you went up the Ute Pass Trail. Tell us about the beginning of your journey up the Ute Pass Trail.
It really began a little bit earlier when I was in New York. And I took a winter hike, snowshoe hike, up a peak in the Adirondacks. At that time in my life, I wasn't deeply fulfilled in my faculty position, although it was very interesting. The things I got to study and working with students was actually very good, but I wasn't sure that was what my life was about. And I got to the top of this peak in the winter, all alone, and it was perfectly blue sky day, everything carpeted in snow. And I just stepped out onto the summit in my snowshoes, and almost immediately my knees got weak, and this huge ball of emotion came up through my throat, and I just let out a bit of a gasp or a wail. And somehow I knew in that moment, I don't know how I knew, but I knew that everything I thought my life was going to be was wrong. And that my life was not as a research psychologist. It wasn't even as a university faculty member, and I had no idea where I was really going. And in that moment, I looked out down into the valley, and there was, on the edge of a stream, of a river, there was something gleaming on the edge, and I think my psyche was just trying to grab a hold of something that I could orient myself by. And it was that gleam on the edge of a river that somehow for me stood for where I was meant to go in the world, in life, and that there was something out there waiting. And all I knew is that I had to wander deeply into the world to find it, and I had to leave behind everything I thought was going to be mine. And I hiked off that summit, and I started doing that. I resigned my faculty position, sold my house, put everything I owned into a subcompact Toyota, and drove west.
Did you know where you were going?
Well, actually, I did.
Okay.
I knew where I was going. I found a postdoc position in community mental health in Oregon, and so and I didn't have to be there for a couple of months. So I just got a chance to wander in the desert and the mountains for a couple of months, and then spent 9 months in Southern Oregon. And at the end of that time, and I did a lot of wandering, internal, psychological and spiritual wandering during that time, as well as spending weekends out in the wild. At the end of that time, or towards the end of that time, I had heard about the work of Stephen Foster and Meredith Little, who, this was in the late 70s, who for a few years by then had been reintroducing what we think of now as the vision quest to the contemporary world. And they were creating a contemporary form of a vision fast. And I heard about them through mutual friends, and I corresponded with them, and I got the basics. So it just sounded like something I needed to do. I knew for so many years in my life I was someone who felt most at home in the wild world. And I knew from the Fosters that a vision quest was a way of finding our deeper place in this world. So I, even before I met them, I basically dragged myself out to the alpine region of northern Colorado, which you had first asked about, and went to a trailhead, and the trailhead happened to be called Ute Pass Trail, and I just set out with my backpack with not a whole lot of food, but enough gear to keep me safe at about 12,000 feet in early September, and headed out to enact my own fast. And I was a little bit concerned that the name of the trail I was starting on was Ute Pass Trail, because on my maps it was named something else, something that sounded like a New England place, which is where I'm from. Old Sawmill Road or something like that. And but on the ground it was called Ute Pass Trail, and I thought, well, this doesn't feel right because it sounds Native American, and I'm not Native American, and I'm out here to do my own version of a Native human solo fast. But the trail took me only about a half mile, and then I could look at that at an overlook on the trail. I could see where the valley, because I was above tree line. I could tell really where I really wanted to go, and there was no trail going that way. And so that was a big symbolic and practical moment for me when I stepped off Ute Pass Trail and wend my way through the wild.
Into the rest of your life.
Into the rest of my life, yes.
So you've written 2 books, and before we began the interview, you were talking about that the first book that you came out with was Soulcraft, and the one that you've just recently come out with is Nature and the Human Soul, but you thought that Nature and the Human Soul was first.
Yes, an early draft of this book, this new one, Nature and the Human Soul, has gone through about 15 drafts. I've been working on it for quite a while. And the first of those drafts was probably complete 15 years ago or so. And when I submitted that manuscript to a potential literary agent, she read it and liked it in a lot of ways, but said she didn't feel it was my first book. And I responded, "You must be wrong, because it's my only book. I'm not planning to write a lot of books." And she said, no, you've got to take the material in this chapter, which was chapter 7, and expand it and make it into a book, and that really should be your first book. And I fought her for a while, but she was right that the the juice, the greatest juice in that early draft of Nature and the Human Soul was this chapter, Chapter 7, and I expanded that and did make it into what ended up being my first published book, Soulcraft. And it's really, Soulcraft is really about what my work has mostly been about for 25 years. And also, by the way, that the early drafts of Nature and the Human Soul, it wasn't ready 15 years ago. There was so much more I had to learn.
It had to cook for a while.
It really did, and I hope it's ready now. I feel it is, but it's come a long ways.
Well, in Soulcraft, because I want to talk about that, you talked about an event, or maybe it was a dream that you had. No, I think it was an event when you were out in the woods up on Ute Pass Trail. You were sleeping in this tarp, a 5-foot by 7-foot tarp, and you woke up the following morning and a butterfly came. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, I was out by an alpine lake for 5 days and nights, and I think it was on the 4th day, it was actually a couple days before then, that I got entranced by a spruce tree that was on the shore of that lake. I just more entranced by a tree than I ever imagined I could have been. And I was sitting those days, fasting, surrounded by absolute alpine magnificence.
And this is Vipassana meditation that you were sitting?
Much of the time I was in meditation. A kind of Vipassana in which I was really offering my reverent attention to the wild world around me. And this particular spruce really spoke to me in some way. And by the 4th day of being alone up there in the wild and fasting, sometime in the middle of that day, that I looked again at the spruce and I saw it for the first time. And I would say it was the first time I ever saw any tree, really. And this particular tree, it's a little bit hard to translate, but the closest I can tell you is that I felt it was, or I knew it was, a monk. Some kind of monk. I could see him in his robe, and he was facing the lake, and had a tremendous stillness about him and presence. And my sense was that he was gazing very, very deeply into the world, more deeply than I knew it was possible to see into the world. And so I was quite entranced. I guess I should say for the listener, for those who have not enacted a vision fast, after 4 days alone in the wild, one's consciousness does change, and I would say it becomes much clearer, and we begin to see wild things more accurately, actually. So after a while, the spruce made a gesture to its left, and I followed that gesture and saw a butterfly. At that point, a very large yellow butterfly. And it was maybe 100 feet or so away, about as far as you can see butterflies easily. And then I saw it fluttering towards me, and it took a typical butterfly path, a wandering path towards me. And it actually came as close to brush against my left cheek, actually touched me. And as it did, I felt a communication. And what it said to me was, in essence, you are a cocoon weaver. And I should say for the listener that, people might ask, well, did the butterfly actually speak in English? And the answer is no. It's kind of like, it is like a dream, or it's like an emotion. I think almost everybody would say that emotions don't speak in English or any human language. They are strong experiences, and then we translate them, or our psyche translates them, and then we can say I'm sad, or I'm angry, or I'm happy, or I'm loving. Similar in our natural human communications with the wild world is that if we're able to listen to our deep imagination, we feel something, we receive a communication, and there's no more doubt about what we're receiving than there is when we experience an emotion. So that's what I got from the butterfly, that my life would have a lot to do with learning how to weave cocoons, which are spaces of transformation, in particular places of death and rebirth. because I think everybody knows that the one who builds a cocoon is the caterpillar, and the caterpillar is creating a place to die as a caterpillar. So, the caterpillar goes into the cocoon, body begins to liquefy, and there's after a number of, I don't know how long, hours or days, there's no more caterpillar left. There's just a liquid that has the potential to form itself into a butterfly or a moth. So that's what I received there in the mountain, and knowing that was my way of belonging to the world. Or I like to use a phrase from David White, the poet, contemporary poet. He speaks of the truth at the center of the image we were born with. And I believe that's a big part of my truth, that image of weaving cocoons. And the soul does not tell us, I believe the soul does not tell us how to do it. It doesn't tell us what cultural forms or job or career path. It doesn't. The soul didn't tell me to be a vision fast guide or a nature-based soul guide or a writer or a psychologist. It said, you need to discover your own way to weave cocoons, transformation for people, and good luck.
Well, we'll have to come back to the good luck that you have had after a short break. I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement, and we are here talking with my guest, psychologist and vision quest guide, Bill Plotkin. And how can people contact you, Bill?
The new book has its own website, natureandthehumansoul.com. It's one word, of course, spelled as one word, and also through my institute in Colorado, Animas Valley Institute, and the website is animas.org. And animus is actually the Spanish word, better pronounced animas, and it's plural. It's souls. It's the plural for souls. animas.org.
Great. Well, we'll take a short break and we'll be right back. So stay tuned. Please go to my website, www.attunement.biz, that's attunement.biz, if you'd like to hear more conversations from this show. I'm Anthony Wright, and we're here talking with my guest, psychologist and vision quest guide, Bill Plotkin. Welcome back, Bill.
Thanks, Anthony.
And before the break, you were talking about the communication that you'd had from the butterfly in being a cocoon weaver, and that you would have to find your own tools and techniques. This is about finding one's own calling. And I think a lot of us are wondering about our own calling. And in the first part of the interview, you were talking about that soulcraft is the chapter in Nature and the Human Soul that had the most juice. And you have a number of steps that you talk about in Soulcraft, about preparing to separate from the everyday world, pathways to the soul encounter, and returning to the world. In Soulcraft, can you talk to us about those three stages? You'd gone off on your own path, you'd severed your links from your own previous world, and now you were into the area of soul development.
Yes, those three phases of soul discovery are the same three steps that we see in rites of passage, or in particular in what Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, called the adventure of the hero. The hero's descent into the underworld to find the mystery at the core of the individual psyche and to bring back a gift or a boon for his or her people. So these are the three stages that we go through, and in Soulcraft is essentially a book about practices for the fourth of 8 stages of human development. As my new book, Nature and the Human Soul, is a model or a map of human development from the point of view of nature. My reading of how nature has designed human beings to develop, the 8 stages that we go through from birth all the way through elderhood. Listeners won't be surprised to hear that these 8 stages look very, very different from what most everybody goes through in the contemporary Western world. I should say the majority of people in the Western world don't go through these 8 stages. We tend to get stalled actually in the third of 8 stages, which psychologically is early adolescence. So, and I think it's taken many centuries for us to get to this point of this gradual cultural degradation.
When you talk about a paradox about that we don't get beyond that adolescence because the parents that were raising us didn't get beyond theirs, exactly. And their grandparents didn't, and their grandparents didn't. And
exactly, it goes back maybe several thousand years, actually. So there's relatively few. I've been making a guess about 20% of contemporary Americans get to the 4th stage of life, which is late adolescence, which is more mature than what I believe the majority of Americans get to. And again, the book Soulcraft is about this 4th stage, and the 4th stage is also, of course, written about in the new book. And I call the 4th stage the stage of the wanderer in the cocoon. And because I call it the cocoon because there are these 3 steps that we need to go through that correspond to the steps of a rite of passage. And the first one is, the first step is dying to our old way of belonging to the world, and the middle step is essentially being dead psychologically, being neither who you were in your earlier life and not yet knowing and being who you're really meant to be, not yet fulfilling your destiny. And the third step is the return to the cultural world, knowing what your true way of participating in the world is. So there are these 3 steps, and the first, there's actually 2 developmental tasks in each of the 8 stages. And one of the tasks is a nature-oriented task, and the second one is a culture-oriented task. And the tasks in each of the stages are different than the other stages. And it's the nature-oriented task that we have minimized
in the industrial society. Yeah.
Starting with early childhood. Parents don't know how to help, most parents don't know how to help their very young children with the nature-oriented task, which has everything to do with preserving the innocence of a child. It's the foundation for everything else, including and especially our soul life.
So how is preserving the innocence different from what people do now? I mean, is it like not throwing all these colorful plastic toys in a crib when a child is really young, or having these mobiles hanging above their head of different plastic things? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, somewhat. There's 3 of the major problems in early childhood. Is first obedience training. Obedience training, in a sense, pulls a very young child away from their natural presence in the world. And innocence essentially is our capacity for present-centeredness. And present-centeredness is our capacity, grows into our capacity for relationship with anything or anyone. We're not really in relationship to anyone, including ourselves, unless we can be really fully present to them. And that our native innocence is essentially our capacity for being present. An infant has no future and no past. It's just right here, right now. And what obedience training does, certainly if it's too much, too soon, it encourages the child to anticipate what is acceptable and what isn't, and it pulls the child out of the present.
And there's some trauma that can happen with that.
On top of the loss of innocence,
yeah.
There can be all kinds of trauma, absolutely. A second kind of problem in early childhood is entitlement training, which seems the opposite in some ways. Especially middle class, upper class parents might shower their children with too many toys, too many entitlements. And it gets a youngster, especially age 2, 3, and 4, starting to be in relationship to life from the point of view of how do I need to behave in order to get more things. And that pulls the young child out of the present.
And that's really when that conditioning is in full swing.
For a lot of children, unfortunately, it's true. And the third thing is parents who are kind of anxious to make sure their kids get the kind of head start where they're going to compete and succeed and do better than everybody else. And so there's all this early emphasis now on, for example, learning how to operate a computer at extraordinarily young ages, age 2 or less.
Competitive kindergarten entrance.
Crawling to the heap.
Crazy.
Of the preschool and so on. And this can be very damaging to a child's development if your goal as a parent is to raise a child who has the capacity to become fully human. Now, on the other hand, if your goal is to raise a child who will be most competitive in school, you might in fact do better with early childhood computer learning and so on, although so many experts disagree with that one now. They say early learning on computers actually doesn't help children, and some studies suggest it is detrimental, actually.
Yeah, because it precludes a lot of the neural pathways.
Neurological development and, again, just the cultivation of that innocence, getting into the second stage of life, middle childhood, with that innocence intact, because that innocence becomes the foundation for the development of wonder in middle childhood. I'm going to make a long story short here. And wonder, which develops most fully through our relationship with nature, our opportunity as children, roughly age 4 to 12, to just play in our own way with other children in the natural world. And that's how we learn really how to become human and how to feel at home in the world.
We have to stop for just a moment and take a short break. I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement. We're talking with my guest, psychologist and Vision Quest guide, Bill Plotkin. And how can people contact you, Bill?
Through my institute's website, www.animas.org. That's ANIMAS.org.
Great. Well, we'll take a short break, and we'll be right back. Please go to my website, www.attunement.biz, that's ATTUNEMENT.biz, if you'd like to hear more conversations from this show. I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement, and we are talking with my guest, psychologist and Vision Quest guide, Bill Plotkin. And Bill, before the break, you were talking about the developmental stages in children, and one of the most important ones to retain innocence was allowing children to play freely in nature to develop a sense of wonder. Can you continue with that, please?
Yes. Wonder that's developed, that blossoms most fully through our time alone or with other children in the natural world. That sense of wonder, when we get to early adolescence, which right after puberty, that sense of wonder becomes the foundation for our capacity to cultivate personal authenticity. When you think about it for a moment, to become an authentic person, to find out who we really are, we have to wonder a lot about ourselves and our relationship to other people and what place we're going to have in the world. And so that capacity for wonder it becomes essential, becomes bedrock to our development in early adolescence. Without it, authenticity, which almost everybody would say they want, becomes a difficult thing to obtain. And so in my book, Nature and the Human Soul, I talk about this third stage of life, which I call the thespian at the oasis, as the stage in which our task is, the nature-oriented task in that stage is becoming an authentic person, or developing an authentic personality, just really on a social level. And the culture-oriented part of that task is to develop a personality that's socially acceptable, that works in a peer group in particular. And doing those two things together, becoming authentic and socially acceptable, is challenging in even a healthy society. In a society like ours that puts so much emphasis on conformity, it's really, really challenging.
When I was in junior high, people would say to me, just be yourself. I had no idea what that meant.
Yes, the hardest thing to do in life in some ways, to be ourselves. So it's difficult to develop an authentic way of belonging to the world in early adolescence, in part because of the emphasis on conformity, in part because of the absence of mature teachers and mentors, and in part because of the developmental deficits from middle childhood, in particular the squelching of our sense of wonder, which started in early childhood with the minimizing or the loss of our inherent innocence as a human being. And so by the time we get to that third stage of early adolescence, there's so many difficulties we have from our early development and the society we live in, that developing that authentic personality becomes really difficult. And because of that, that's why I believe the majority of people in Western society get stalled right there in that third stage. But I think almost everybody gets at least to the threshold. They at least have kind of glimmers of the fourth stage, which is the wanderer in the cocoon. And I want to give you a couple examples of those glimmers. For most even vaguely healthy teenagers, young people begin to ask questions at some point about, well, I wonder what life is about beyond getting trained to get a decent job, to make decent money, to buy a lot of stuff. There's got to be something more to life. I mean, that's what mainstream society says. That's what life is about. Earning money to get a lot of stuff. But teenagers will begin to wonder about that, and they'll begin to get depressed, or if they're lucky, really full-blown grief about that's the world that they've been born into. Other examples that are a little bit happier. A healthy teenager will start to wonder what's the difference between sex and romance. Really good question. And that means the person is starting to approach the threshold into the next stage of life.
Yeah, and that actual question between sex and romance is really blurred in today's hyper-communicative culture.
Yes. We talk a lot about romance, and it's something that's, alluring to most everybody. And I think people do experience romance. I mean, I'm not meaning to imply otherwise, but when we really ask what's the difference between sex and romance, and we really go deeply into the mysteries of romance, that's actually a stage 4 experience. Teenagers might also begin to wonder what poetry is, or they might feel like spending some time alone, but not because they're depressed, but because they want to sit with some big questions. Or they might feel like spending time in nature alone and really being curious about the wild world. But for those people who do manage to cross the threshold into stage 4, the cocoon, those people are about to embark on a very wild ride. It's that death rebirth experience. And then again, the culture task actually of the cocoon is to separate ourselves from our adolescent identity, to say goodbye to everything we thought we were. And so in that stage, in a healthy environment or in a nature-based or indigenous tradition, the young people would actually be removed from everyday society at that point. And they'd be brought to a place somewhat separate from the village where they can be trained in practices that help open our human consciousness to the mysteries of both the natural world and the human psyche. That's actually the subtitle of Soulcraft, Crossing into the Mysteries of nature and psyche. And part of what the elders or initiation guides will teach the young people are practices for separating one's consciousness from one's adolescent or early adolescent identity. And the other half of what the mentors or the guides or the elders teach are specific practices for exploring the mysteries of the world and asking and sitting with those really big questions. And there's just many, many dozens of practices, and they're found in healthy cultures and subcultures all over the world, including our own Western traditions. If you look at the mystery schools of our Western religions, we'll find these things. And Soulcraft outlines about 25 or so of these kinds of practices. I call them Soulcraft practices, but I didn't invent them. They're found in nature-based traditions all over the world. And they include things like the vision fast, or certain kinds of dream work, or ways of being alone in the natural world, ways of communicating with natural things other than humans, self-designed ceremony, very careful nature observation, including tracking of other creatures, and so on. There's quite a few. And these are the practices that essentially alter our consciousness and alter the way we are in the world. And they open our awareness to the possibility of receiving, or actually of seeing a reflection of our own souls, of seeing the truth at the center we were born with. And that's ultimately the goal of the second stage, is to uncover, in more common Western terms, to uncover our destiny, or our sacred calling, or our individual purpose.
To uncover the center we were born with.
The truth at the center.
The truth at the center.
Of the image we were born with. So we might say, I might say, I guess I've already said it, that I believe the image I was born with was the weaving of cocoons. And there are quite a few truths at the center of that image for me that I gradually began to learn, starting at age 30, when I had that experience on the mountain, what a cocoon is, and how to create cultural context for people entering that kind of place.
But it's really pivotal for one's life to come to understand what that core truth is.
I believe it's pivotal to reaching full psychological maturity, or true adulthood, or becoming fully human. And more to the point, or maybe even more directly, finding that truth, which is unique for each one of us, is the key to the deepest personal fulfillment we'll experience in this lifetime. And absolutely as important as that, it's the key to our most valuable form of service to the world. And in today's society, we think of service as, I don't know, like a sacrifice or difficult labors. But what all the wisdom ways that I've encountered around the world say is that fulfillment, personal fulfillment, and true service to the world are the two sides of a single coin. You can't really have one without the other. That we are most fulfilled by finding our way to give, or to give away to the world.
That which our truth about our life is.
That kernel, that acorn, that...
And when people find this truth, there's no doubt about that, is there?
That's a good question, In essence, there isn't any doubt about it. And, I mean, in the sense that a person is struck dumb by that glimpse. And almost everybody feels, I think anybody would normally feel that this is too big for me, or this is too puzzling, this is too mysterious. And one way you've had that glimpse is that it feels like the greatest blessing you could have ever have imagined to receive that knowledge. And simultaneously it feels like the greatest burden you could possibly have had laid on you. It just feels it's actually a type of violation of our identity, and while at the same time, as I say, a great blessing. And so if you have an experience like that feels like both a blessing and a burden, then you know that's what's happened to you.
And you're speaking about the violation of the identity in terms of being asked to go very far beyond what you think you are. Is that right?
What you thought you were.
What you thought you were, right.
Yeah, and all of a sudden it's a new world, a new life.
And the old you, there is no old you.
You can't go back to it. Mm-hmm. You could try, but you'd probably fail. Mm-hmm. But the passage from late adolescence, the cocoon, to early adulthood, which I call the apprentice at the wellspring, that passage I name soul initiation. It's the moment when we are initiated into our soul life, which begins with early adulthood. And again, the poet David Whyte has this extraordinary phrase. He says, I believe he's talking about that moment in a poem called All the True Vows. And he says, in that moment, you can make a promise it will kill you to break. And that promise, in essence, is that you're going to do everything you can to live the truth at the center of the image you were born with. That experience that is both a blessing and a burden, you're going to do everything you can now to embody it, to live it into the world, to bring it back to your society as your gift to the world. And once you make that promise, that utter commitment to do that, I believe that's the moment of soul initiation. It's not when the elders get together and declare you a man or a woman.
Or give you the piece of paper after you step off the stage that says PhD after.
Exactly. Yeah, the elders may or may not provide you with a ceremony of that sort, but that's not what initiates us. It's our relationship to our own psyche and our relationship to the world that initiates us.
Well, we're going to have to take a short break. These breaks are coming up too quickly.
Yes.
I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement, and we are here talking with my guest, Dr. Bill Plotkin, who is a psychologist and a vision quest guide. And how can people contact you, Bill?
Well, the new book, Nature and the Human Soul, has we have put together a website for it. And if you remember the title of the book, that's it. It's natureandthehumansoul.com.
Great. Well, we'll take a short break, and we'll be right back.
Please go to my website, www.attunement.biz, that's ATTUNEMENT.biz, if you'd like to hear more conversations from this show.
I'm Anthony Wright, and I'm your host today on Attunement, and we are here talking with my guest, Dr. Bill Plotkin, who is a psychologist and a vision quest guide. And before the break, Bill, you were talking about early adulthood, the stage 5 in Nature and the Human Soul. What comes next after that? Or is there things that you didn't talk about fully about stage 5?
Well, the task of stage 5, the developmental task, is in essence, now that you know the piece of the mystery that is yours to bring into the world, now, of course, the question is, how are you going to do it? And in early adulthood, we need to identify one or more cultural forms or practices or disciplines or careers or crafts which are effective ways of bringing our gift to our people in our particular society, in the time and place where we live, and given whatever our personal strengths and weaknesses are. How am I going to do it? And in essence, what we end up doing is finding some person or persons and some discipline to apprentice to. We might be just apprenticing to one person, a master of one of the crafts that resonate with what our destiny holds for us. So that's the task of early adulthood, is to identify a delivery system, if you will, for our gift, to study with a master in a certain craft, and to thereby bring our gift to the world. through our work and also just through our way of being. And I should say it's something, one of the most important things to me, and if as much a reason of why I wrote this book, Nature and the Human Soul, is it has everything to do with the times we live in now, which everybody listening to this, and anybody who's awake at all, knows we live in a time of tremendous crisis and equally great opportunity. I think we're at an evolutionary edge, not just obviously as a species.
Gene Houston calls this jump time.
Jump time.
We're in jump time.
We are in jump time, and it remains to be seen whether we succeed or not. One of my teachers, Thomas Berry, calls this the time of the great work, the 21st century, the time of the great work. And it's what he's referring to is the work of creating human societies which can exist as what he calls an integral presence with the greater Earth community. And
you're talking about nature, not rather than other cultures. You're talking about the Earth community as Gaia.
Yes, we have to create societies that are life-sustaining, in which we humans take our place again as members of this greater world. And another teacher of mine, Joanna Macy, the eco-philosopher and Buddhist scholar and deep ecologist, she calls this the time of the great turning. And she uses the phrases that we're moving from our industrial growth society, which is suicidal, to hopefully a life-sustaining society that's based more in cooperation and compassion. So, so this time, I'll call it the time of the great turning, I believe what we need more than anything are visionaries who are creating the new cultural forms that will lead us to a world that works for ourselves and other species. And I believe the term visionary is essentially a synonym, or points to the same people I call true adults. All true adults are visionaries. And at this time of cultural disintegration, all true adults are agents of cultural transformation. And all true adults are leaders. And not necessarily on a big stage. Some adults lead in some kind of grand way, and others in very quiet ways, in families or farms and so on. But every one of us was born to have a piece. Every one of us who's alive today, I have no doubt, was born with a piece of this great cultural change we need to make in this century. And that's why, that's really why I wrote the book, because I think it's a map that can help people mature into those adults, and can help parents and teachers support children and teenagers to mature into adults. So that's early adulthood. Real briefly, late adulthood is similar, except at that threshold passage between early and late adulthood is that crisis time when we realize that all the crafts, the delivery systems that we had learned from others are now no longer big enough for the creativity that the soul wants to bring forth into the world. And then we have to leave behind, in a certain sense, our identity again. We have to leave behind the way we were doing it, the way we were imagining our lives, and find our own never-before-seen ways of bringing our gift to the world. And that becomes the task of late adulthood. And if you'd like, I'd say a few things about elderhood.
Please.
Elderhood, again, is a completely different thing.
And this is stage 7?
7 and 8. These last two stages of life are completely different than adulthood, and even more radically different than what we think of being what is a senior citizen or retired person. This is a very, very different thing. At the highest, in a healthy society, the highest status in life is elderhood. And the elders have even the stage 7 elders, which I call the masters in the grove of elders. The masters have even a greater task than adults do, because the elders have the task of caring for the soul of the more than human community, which we're talking about the entire web of life. It's the human elders whose job is to see to it, for example, that the balance is maintained in a good way between the life and activities of the human village on the one hand and the greater earth community on the other. This is, I think it should be obvious to everybody why that's so essential. And if we don't have elders, it's also obvious what happens to the world. And the shortest way to say that, it's what we have now. So elders are just an absolute jewel or godsend to the entire earth community.
And then stage 8.
Stage 8 is a very, very mysterious, mystical stage. When we move from stage 7 to 8, we move beyond doing to a life fully of being, again, which is somewhat like the first stage of life, a life of being, especially if parents let their young children be. But in stage 8, we're moving into a stage of being with full consciousness. And since we've moved beyond being in stage 8, there's no task at all. But there is something absolutely essential that happens in that last stage, and that's what I call tending the universe, which it is as mystical as that sounds. And I've learned mostly about that by spending a few days with the great cultural historian Thomas Berry. He's 93 now, and the way he explained it is that the elder, or the sage in particular, his and her job is to coordinate, this is Thomas Berry's words, to coordinate the human realm with the cosmological realm. And I probably should leave it there because it's a great mystery. It's a little bit hard to explain. I do it in part through stories in that chapter. And besides, of course, it'd be great if people went out and bought the book.
Yes.
And you could read there about stage 8.
And we are out of time, I'm sorry to say, but this has been quite an engaging conversation. I so much appreciate your being here with us. How can people contact you, Bill?
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. People can find me and my colleagues at the website of my institute, which is Animas Valley Institute. It's in western Colorado. The website is www.animas.org, animas.org.
Great. I'm Anthony Wright, and I've been your host today on Attunement, and we've been talking with my guest, psychologist and Vision Quest guide, Bill Plotkin.
Please go to my website, www.attunement.biz, that's ATTUNEMENT.biz, if you'd like to hear more conversations from this show. 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 Conversations from this show.